I'm assuming that everybody can see that. Today I'm going to be talking about next generation storytelling. So, hi, nice to meet you. I'm going to introduce myself first. I'm going to introduce Sugar as well, the company that I'm director of, because I think that gives a little bit of context to the rest of the discussion. I'm then going to briefly cover new transmedia story forms, as this helps frame some of the key ideas we'll be looking at. We're then going to look at the technical toolkit that allows us to realize these new and immersive forms. And from there, I'm going to dive into the challenges and opportunities that come with building narratives that work within these formats. It's going to get a little bit theoretical, but bear with me on that one. Lastly, I'll explore how these principles were realized in delivering live projects. So particularly how they were utilized in delivering Wallace and Gromit's The Big Fix-Up, and also Dr. Seuss's ABC AR. This is me. I am a creative technologist. For those of you who may be watching this with a sight impairment, I am a white male in my early 30s. I am sat in a room with white walls with some old wooden boxes nailed to the wall. I am creative director at Sugar Creative and co-owner of Fictioneers. Sugar Creative as a company is a creative technology studio. It's got a 20-person team and it's based across the UK. We create industry-leading, cutting-edge, single and multi-user digital experiences for brands and organizations worldwide, including AR, VR, and MR. All very corporate, but essentially just tries to encompass the fact that we find unusual, interesting, and bold things and look at how they can be applied to do really unusual, cool, and hopefully genre-changing pieces of work. Through emerging technologies, we make imagination real. We create systems to redefine the possible and ultimately deliver wonder. This focus on experience allows us to embrace whatever is needed to realize a vision. It looks to create outcomes that through new forms are still rooted in a shared, very human experience or need. We've had the pleasure of working with a range of companies, including Dr. Seuss, Aardman, Lexus, and a bunch of others. Some of these projects that involve these partners, ones that you'll see throughout this talk. A note on the stuff that you're actually going to see, we've tried where possible to keep the things that we've done or that have been done by people like Google, or Apple, or Unity as demonstrations of potential. We want this to be rooted in what is possible, not pie in the sky thinking, because a lot of discussion is around what is possible. We are currently delivering the UK Audience of the Future Entertainment Demonstrator. I mention this because it is a fascinating exploration by the UK government. It was a £20 million government-backed initiative looking at allowing 4 leading voices in the emerging technology field to create viable international demonstrators. Demonstrators which illustrated the potential offered by emerging technologies when creating experiences for future audiences. This is the initiative that gave rise to Wallace and Gromit, The Big Fix-Up, which I'm going to be diving into later. We're also extremely proud to be selected as one of the delivery teams for Festival UK 2022, a £120 million government-funded project that looks at how STEAM, not just arts and technology, can be used to drive creative innovation on a cultural level. So let's move into the meat of this. Firstly, transmedia. Q1, massively inadequate, but hopefully quite interesting transmedia mandala. Transmedia defines any content structure that harnesses multiple forms to tell a story or set of linked stories. Now, I know you're going to be mostly familiar with this, but I think it's worth diving into. The mandala here on screen shows an example of this in which a central story world allows a narrative to emerge, manifests as a core form, and a set of other experiences or stories that either tie into it or tie to the wider world, living and connecting with it. By utilizing this structure, we're able to provide not just a central story, but a range of access points and broader content, which enrich each of the stories told, as well as generating wider awareness. The key here is that it does all of this without diminishing each individual sub-element. From a practical angle, we can imagine a central game, which has an animated film set that's set in the same world. This could feature NPCs from the game. a graphic novel which gives the backstory to the protagonist that you are assuming the role of, and a series of social media experiences or AOG content. It's important to stress that these spring from the same world and allow a breadth of experience, and which, because of their intersectionality, provide individual and personal depth of experience. For a real-world example, you will all be familiar with the work that Marvel have done, creating a single, cohesive but evolving ecosystem with an almost unbelievable number of points of contact. Like or not the content, the work that they put into building a world and achieving a transmedia implication is something that is fascinating in its own right. Now, I said I wasn't going to talk about future potential, but I'm going to touch on it briefly in regards to transmedia. We all know that our world has infinite amounts of data living above, alongside, invisible. Now, most of the advances in emerging entertainment technology and communication technology involve dissolving those barriers, dissolving the barriers between data and place. This enables us to have infinite real and imagined worlds coexisting. With the ability to blend those into ours, we have the ability to live in multiple realities, multiple imagined realities, in which your experience is enriched manifold, from history to story. Any conceivable type of experience, learning, contextualization is able to be achieved because of that blending, that breaking down of barriers into our world. That does segue nicely into bringing worlds to life. When creating next generation storytelling, we are looking at bringing worlds to life in some way, or at least this is what I've chosen to focus on. It's not the only type of next generation storytelling, but it is a next generation storytelling which I think is particularly relevant and the one that we've tried to embody with a lot of our work. To help do this, I'm going to take a step back and look at the core tools that have enabled us to do this. These next generation immersive tools give us the building blocks that form the basis of the new type of story and allow us to create experiences based upon adding, transporting, transforming, enriching, and sharing creative content of the stories that we generate. So we're going to start with some additive immersive tools. I've got some pretty slides. Some of these are some GIFs, so they will take a moment or two to load. Core to bring imagination to life is the act of augmenting reality. You will all have seen this before in one shape or another, I'm sure, but it adds content to the real world and lets us therefore manifest created structural narrative elements. These manifest elements can be anything from digital video content to animated models to soundscapes. The key then is that once they're in our world, we're able to interact with them and them with us. These interactions again can be almost limitless, and in their simplest form range from direct touch to position and movement or voice. This gives us, again conveniently visible through some of the GIFs that are on your screen, the power to learn to read with characters from Dr. Seuss, critically in your own bedroom, to have a kickabout with the wrong trousers when in the park. And even, I think this is one of my favorite projects that we've actually done, on the right-hand side, to achieve a system whereby you can have home diagnosis of declining cognitive conditions that is able to be offered to patients in a safe, comfortable, and familiar space. Once in our world, it's possible to give this content intelligence. This was seen as the next generation of AR a few years back. It's what was part triggered by Unity developing their Mars engine. Through intelligent AI, you give the content awareness of the world in which it finds itself. So you've brought this content into a world, you're able to interact with it, but you can also give that content an awareness of the space in which it finds itself. This can start with simple things, such as knowing how bright the world is, so that you can add shadows. But it can also be things like knowing the position of tables or walls in the real world, so that objects can be occluded from your sight as they move around them. As they are able to be occluded, as they know these spaces, they can also move and interact with them. This combined can evolve into dynamic interaction, which, and I think this is really key in terms of how going on to how you tell a story, within spaces which are individual, personal, and unique. My bedroom is fundamentally different to any other bedroom, but we're able to place content into that space and then have that space be part of my story. On the screen at the moment, you can see some examples of this. In the center, you can see an Ichabod that knows where in your kitchen he can hide, so outside of where you can see him, and then you can play hide and seek with him. On the right, you have robot pigeons, which are able to appear in your room and then fly around that room naturally, landing on things and interacting with you and the content of the room. It would take a dedicated session to begin to even scratch the surface of this, because the potential are almost endless. But for now, I'm just going to move on, and we're going to look at transportative immersive tools very quickly. Transportative for us has always been somewhat magical, but somewhat different. You are taking people and transporting them to imagined spaces. When talking about this from an augmented reality point of view, it's a space that you can move around physically as if you were there. So you are walking through places. This is nothing short of giving someone a doorway to infinite realities in their pocket. On the screen at the moment, you can see a couple of examples of this. On the left, our doorway to history that lets users step back into Victorian England. It takes them to Mitre Square, the scene of the last murder by Jack the Ripper, and then they can walk around that space. They can hear Victorian London. They can move and discover the clues. They can learn by doing this. On the right, you've actually got a bit of a behind-the-scenes glimpse, an upcoming dungeon puzzle adventure, letting you step into dungeon rooms one after another and explore the puzzles and work out the story that is hidden within them. A slightly different type of transportative experience is when you are realizing a self-contained virtual space. In this, you can explore and interact as if you were there. And this is one of the tools that we leveraged for Wallace Gromit's The Big Fix-Up. Here's a couple of clips from you exploring Bernard Grubb's lab and the content within it. This will become more directly and obviously relevant when it comes to our story later on. We also have the potential for transformative immersive tools. When adding content to the real world, we're able to draw on what is already there. This transformative immersion builds on, enriches, and contextualizes the world around you. It's a bit nebulous, but I think we've got some examples to hopefully elucidate it. In the center, you've got an example of how a toy can become a controller. This doubles also as an example of how a sculpture or an object that you have created and placed into the real world can have its history revealed to you. Now, this is particularly prevalent as a concept in the UK at the moment, with trying to understand how historical sculptures and statues that were either made with money from slavery or that relate to edifying people from history who kept slaves can be seen and understood with a contextual information. You also have on the far right, your object, your face, and how you can become a character in your own story. This is you being transformed into Wallace. I'm going to mention a specific subset of this type of augmentation and story component, which is image-based content. Now, it's one of the earliest forms of AR, but it has some of the most incredible tools for building wider story worlds. It lets you transform everyday objects into items from a story, or bringing them to life in a way that ties back in, lets you realize that imagined space. Now, one of the examples on the left here is a billboard. Now, this is a billboard advertising example we made, but it applies to almost anything. So if you can imagine a transmedia story and you have a centralized element, but you also want to put advertising or propaganda pieces into the real world in a way that people will encounter, and then go back to your story and then back into the real world and augment them and find out how they tie together. it gives you a real tool to be able to do that. Obviously, you can go nuts with it. You can have objects from the imagined world. If you wanted to have some sort of Harry Potter-esque butterbeer, you can, because you can transform and change and augment. The less said about the picture of one of our designer's tattoos, the better, but I think it does itself show that if you wanted to place your story in and around people, you have some fantastic opportunities there as well. We've talked about putting content into our world, having it aware, but you can also harness and utilize immersive tools that draw on the world itself to provide a canvas for narrative enrichment. By drawing on AI and both external and internal data gathering from devices, we can allow narrative content to respond to the real world in more rich ways. This can be from any data. For example, your narrative content could be weather dependent or reactive to the weather around the user. On the right, you can see how the Cowardly Lion created by Google reacts to ambient light, becoming scared when it gets dark, meaning that your control over the physical environment can become a component of a story that your digital overlaid content can be aware of and react to. The potential of that is kind of evident in terms of story. However, we can go a little bit deeper than that. You'll see in the slightly smaller images on the phone that an AI awareness of that world, of the world around us, can allow us to create story moments that draw directly from the world. I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent and a bit of a kind of idea that we were playing around with in the studio that got us really inspired. If you imagine an experience that lets you hear the story of a person, one in which their life's myriad moments are tied to objects which evoke them from their memory. As you move around the space that you're in, any flowers, for example, would trigger a story moment in which the protagonist talks about the first time their love gave them a rose, whilst encountering a fork could trigger reminiscences on a cake that their grandmother always used to make them. It's a little bit twee, but as a way to look at how we look at memory and story and placing that into our world and how we as humans tell stories, it starts to again blur those boundaries. These environmental responses create a highly personal connection with the story, and which critically varies between each person for unique experiences. At the other end of the spectrum is our ability to tie narrative content to places and positions. These positions and places are in the real world. By using GPS data, we're able to set story content that you travel to encounter. This can be specific location, or thanks to Google's mapping of location types, specific sorts of places. You want to have story or interactive content that's based around coffee, and be that a story of meeting somebody in a cafe or going to hunt caffeinated ghosts. They could be tethered to any sort of cafe, any sort of seller of coffee. Now that could be, Tony, lovely comment. That can be at a local level, that can be at a national level, that can be an international level. On screen, you can see a couple of moments from an upcoming experience that we're creating. The first linked with local stories that specify given city streets to let you explore the history of the place and the narratives that are hidden beneath the surface within it. The second, some items that you can discover in the real world as part of the treasure hunt game that we're building. A more rich version of this is where we embed story content to a specific place. Now, we call this geolocational AR as opposed to geopositional AR, but I'm aware that these are abstracted terms. By creating a digital twin of a space, and at this point I do want to shout out, if you're looking to make anything which does this sort of thing, go chat to the guys at Phantasmo. They powered this geolocational experience content for Wallace and Gromit, the Big Fix-Up. And not only are they incredible people, but they're also providing one of the most incredibly versatile pieces of technology out there in the sector. This lets us make story content that will be part of the real world space on a huge scale. We'll touch on a bit in some detail with some of our case studies, but you can see here a digital scan of a location from Wallace Gromit's The Big Fix-Up, and then you can see how we've able to manifest actually, I tell a lie, that this is not that digital scan, it's a different one. This allows a giant robot to emerge in AR and land in front of you as part of a narrative beat. Now, I want to stress, because we see a lot of this is not a video with post-production. This is direct footage from a mobile on location as you're seeing it in AR. Because we know where the buildings are, because we know where you are in relation to those buildings, because we can position you relatively to it, we can make things appear from behind buildings, we can make them interact with buildings, and we can make them interact with you. So you want Godzilla to climb a building and jump down in front of you? Great. I'm still pitching and wanting to create some giant Cthulhu-driven adventure in which you have portals from other dimensions opening up above cities and interacting with locations, because this is magic for us. This is what enables us to make imagination real. It doesn't have to be unique. It doesn't have to be personal, because we can share these things. Experiences are better together. We are able to harness a range of tools that share these immersive experiences with other people. This can be together in the same location or together in different locations. On the right-hand side here, you can see a clip from our multi-user learning platform, Cognovi. This lets children access and display content, but more importantly, it lets them share and be guided through stories of objects, be they historical or geographic or biological, that can be seen in front of them and the teacher and be controlled by the teacher, irrespective of whether or not they're in the same classroom or remotely. On the other side, you can see some initial playtesting of another project still in development, a shared dragon fighting story experience. You have AI-driven monsters, you have a central bad guy, and you have partners that are joining with you to defeat its big fiery eneminess. So those are some of the cool tools that we have available to build our stories. Hopefully they've been quite interesting and quite inspiring. The question then moves to, how, if we have these new tools, do we look at building a next generation of stories? This is, as I said earlier, going to be a little bit theory heavy, but bear with me. This is the product of a lot of work, and whilst I think it's quite interesting, I'm also willing to entertain that it might be completely wrong. We know this is new and experimental, and we are constantly shifting our expectations. And if you disagree with me, I want to hear it, because we love learning from our mistakes. If you pause me, bear with me 1 second. A lot of what we have just discussed looked at the role of experience as a driving force for the story through interaction. To consider this within a story structure, we need to balance how moments of the story that we create as authors, and I prefer architects when it comes to story, because it becomes less prescriptive. As soon as you start thinking of yourself as an architect rather than someone who's just telling something, you start to have a very different mindset on what you're building, how they can involve the user. We see this as being driven by motivation. The narrative engages the user, and within a moment or beat, this engenders motivation on the part of the user. This motivation can then be used to drive and understand and contextualize interactions that is then the personal involvement for whoever's taking part. The outcome of these interactions then provide context, content, or change that in turn progresses the narrative on which it was originally based. The overall experience for the user, their story, is then driven as a balance between our narrative creation and their interaction with it. So how can this work on a larger scale when looking at a full story? Again, the key is to look at this from an experiencer's perspective. We're not saying we're coming from above and dictating. We're empathizing with the audience, and we're looking at how they perceive what will be a unique story by dint of its delivery. We have a narrative that's driven by beats. These subcomponents of the narrative are defined by change or events of some way. Inside a beat, a number of moments can be encountered. It's possible for these to be in any order, or for them to be linked to a given order or a given set of requirements. But key here is that they create a rich and choice-driven experience. When that full set is done, or when a key moment has been reached or completed, the next beat is then able to be realized. The moments then within each beat create both a different way of looking at chronology and a different way of looking at what would traditionally be intensity maps. I'm going to go on a limb and say most of you will have seen a lot of intensity maps for films and games. Here we have a slightly different version of this, where we have known beats of the story for complexity and excitement, but within those, we then have peaks and troughs and moments of reflection and moments of action that let us be a lot more subtle. So our two-dimensional graph becomes a three-dimensional one, in which we're going up and creating secondary types of intensity. Now, I just mentioned interactions and choice. Both of these give users agencies, the freedom to explore and create a personal story. Now, I'm not going to go into the nature of agency and experience in games, certainly not in the kind of depth that would do it justice, because there is nowhere near enough time, and there's an awful lot of people who will talk about it from many, many different angles. It's really important to us to understand agency, because again, when taking it away from an authorial directive and making it about a user's experience of the story from their point outwards, we have to understand how they feel about it. This roots us as not the teller, but an architect, providing the space in which people can experience a narrative. The perception of choice and the involvement that the user has enhances their experience, even when this does not have an effect on the story. And I think this is really important. Your involvement makes the experience personal, as you have an active role. We'll come back to that point, but I just want to go into this diagram that I've thrown up on the screen. In this, you can see a couple of ways of realizing agency within a story. You have the inception of the story beat. You then see a couple of interactions which branch off from it. These can be encountered in any order or not at all, neither of which affect the perception of the narrative. Think about being in a library and just pulling books that you're dipping into and then returning to the shelf. Continuing through the diagram, you experience a prescribed interaction that takes the form of a choice. The choice has two set outcomes, both of which result in a change, so we have the outcome points, but which do not affect the outcome of the story. Think being made to choose a hat that you wear to your execution. It doesn't matter which hat you're wearing because you get your head cut off, but it becomes a personal and active choice. To give a more real setting to this, I'm just going to mention Papers, Please by Lucas Pope. It's a great story experience that shows how choice can make your feelings within the story part of that story. You make decisions about the fate of others whilst at the same time being constrained by the world and the story. This has the effect of challenging your perceptions, the nature of what it means to be a good protagonist, and also what it means to have a good ending. I encourage you all to go, and for us, it was one of those touch points that changed the way that we built our stories, that went beyond film and game and all of those different media types. I think if I wanted you to take anything from this, it's specifically that balance of agency as action, but not necessarily agents of choice. I don't need it to be a choose your own adventure book for me to have an involvement in it. If I am taking part, even if I just have to pause and then make an active choice to continue, I am immediately put into the driving seat, even if the story architect knows exactly what's going to happen and knows exactly where this is going. So how does all of this tie together, especially within transmedia delivery? This is the last bit of theory, I promise. We use what we call the steel thread principle. Working inwards from the world in which the narrative takes place, we identify the central needs of the narrative to deliver the core story for the participant, mostly actually in terms of the core emotional impacts. This becomes our steel thread. You can see this in black in the middle of the diagram. From here, we're able to identify points of depth for the user, moments in which the story can have optional events and can become personalized. Whilst not being critical to the experience, these optional elements reward users who invest time and effort by giving a more detailed experience of that story. Alongside these elements of narrative depth, we build in elements of experience depth, things which enrich the overall experience. This could be opportunities to delve into the lore of the world or play within spaces from the story. I mean, you will have in your head a million different examples of that. But for me, diving into the lore can be anything from stepping in to see moments of bits of history, playing within the spaces could be the opportunity to go and rootle through the drawers of a character without them being aware of it. As you can see from the diagram, we tie these components to beats in the story to ensure they maintain consistency with a world that shifts according to the overall story arc. For an example of that, let's just imagine that we are going to talk to a bunch of people within a town as part of a story in which we eventually will set sail on a boat. Once we set sail on a boat, those optional experiences need to be cut off. So that's where you tie these optional activities to story beats, making sure there is a logical consistency. Now, that sounds massively self-evident, but it comes down to planning. All of this is about planning and understanding what a different type of story can be, and then adjusting and building it accordingly. Lastly, we identify points where the user can engage with completely isolated activities that are broadly linked to the story or world space. Opportunities for the expansion of the experience, wider connection, and for bleed points for people into the story. This can be as simple as the social media filter, which changes you into a version of Wallace that we created for the Big Fix-Up, which segues nicely into how we realized these principles in some of our projects. How am I doing on time? Not too bad. Let's look first at Wallace and Gromit, the Big Fix-Up. This was created with Aardman as part of the Audience of the Future project, in partnership with TRG and Potato, and it's the first new story to feature the dynamic duo in 10 years. It's a transmedia experience with a story structured over 3 acts. It's tied to a flexible chronology that allows us users to join at any point, but by being relative to them, still take part in a story that evolves over time. Delivered with a core mobile application, it contains or connects to content in a range of media forms, with comics, short films, social media content, social media activities, immersive mobile VR, and explorative play, as well as live immersive experiences. I'm going to dive into a few bits of these to show how they realize the theory that we were just discussing. I do recommend you go and play it, not for any commercial reason, but because it is an interesting exploration and something which we have acknowledged has flaws and has helped drive our understanding forward to the projects that we're doing next. Central to the manifestation of the story as a transmedia experience is the continuity of content. Video, XR, and AR story modes share the same elements created from the narrative world with a consistent aesthetic. The idea of a consistent aesthetic was doubly vital with Wallace and Gromit, where the claymation style forms a huge part of their memorability. We need to specifically create a range of tools, shaders, models that allowed us for the digital characters to feel as if they'd been made by hand. This actually included a custom system that let us put fingerprints onto the models as they were created. On the screen here, you can see Big Lad, which is in a cutscene with Bernard Grubb, in a story-critical mobile XR moment at the center, where you explore the lab that was mentioned earlier, and in the AR finale, where you have to do battle with Big Lad to save Wallace. The challenge here lies in the technical elements of their creation. The cutscene is a film-grade animation, predominantly done by the team at Aardman, whilst the gameplay moments are in real time on a mobile phone, all powered within Unity. By identifying the delivery needed for each beat, right from the start, we're able to create a cascading asset pipeline that let us be suitable for use for every needed opportunity right from the start. Now, although that doesn't sound much, from a practical and production point of view, not doing that either means that you will not be consistent or that you just won't have the ability to make a transmedia next generation story. Creating this consistency has the benefit that we're able to create a smooth movement and immersive experience from a user's perspective, irrespective of the content format. To take another element of this experience that draws on some of these principles, we have the emergency jobs. Throughout the story, you're called upon to take part in these emergency jobs. They're AR-driven experiences, and they are play-based interactions at the heart of story beats. They place you in the middle of the action. As part of the narrative, these become available to you as the story progresses, linked to your action and personal chronology. Some of these are required for overall story progression, whilst others electively enrich your experience of it. On the screen at the moment are some clips of you capturing escaped robot pigeons, chasing after them in a park and throwing them into a cage contraption. In contrast to the immersive play, which is heavily core story linked, these are AR emergency jobs, the Big Fix-Up features rich explorative play alongside it. Throughout the story, you acquire blueprints, parts, and gadgets. These allow you to create your own contraptions in your own workshop. Once created, you can use these contraptions to help Wallace on cleaning jobs, or doing these activities gives you a reward. It's linked to the story world and ties actively to story content, but provides optional user-directed experiences. Though agency-driven, it does not affect the story outcome, providing the added richness that we were talking about earlier. From one set of beloved characters to another, let's look at Dr. Seuss's ABC and Amazing AR Alphabet through the same lens. Dr. Seuss's ABC AR is based on Dr. Seuss's ABC. It's a book. Now, that presents the challenge of keeping the feel of that book, but also extending it in a way that has done before. This is very different to Wallace Gromit, where we had the opportunity to work with Adam and create a brand new story. This is taking a story and extending and enriching, but not losing the key values of it. So your interactions are based on learning and the imagination. You can interact, as you can see on screen, with each letter alongside the rhyme that you hear to draw the letters. This triggers the book to come to life in a way that it never had before. In the same vein as working on a claymation style, to recreate the work of Ed Geisel, who wrote Dr. Seuss, and not have it encompass his shading, his drawing, the slightly anarchic quality of the characters, would be to do it a disservice. So again, we had to make sure that the characters fit. And that's almost something that we don't talk about in terms of story, because it's where other factors, brands, IPs, factor in, but it is something which is key to tone and about the nature of the world in which it all sits. We also had the opportunity to extend the core story with elements of emergent storytelling, similar to what we were talking about with the play-based experiences in Wallace and Gromit and those linked experiences, but with a slightly different focus. As authors of a space, we were able to use, in this instance, Unity's Mars system to create procedural environments that adjusted themselves to your unique spaces. You can see here some of the environments created in my kitchen and one of my developers' kitchens. The objects that spawn are based upon the height of the objects, the nature of the objects, the floor space available, and all of the parameters you would expect from detecting the real world. The characters within that then also have AI. This lets you play with them. So not only have we brought the characters of this imagined Dr. Seussian world to life, they then become your friends. With them, you can paint. So you can make clouds of paint spawn above large flat surfaces. And this is key to understanding the environment again. They will spawn above sections of floor, sections of table, but nowhere else. You can then make the characters walk through the paint with you controlling them. or you can set them to enable them to walk themselves. It also lets you play fetch, where you can throw balls around your room without breaking crockery and have them fetch and return it to you. Lastly, you can play hide and seek, something which we touched on earlier. It's still something which blows my mind, even though we made it, to say, okay, I'd like to play hide and seek with the Sycamore and have them tell you to close your eyes, screen goes dark, they run off. They run off inside your space, and then you have to go and find them. You say, well, is this story? Well, for me, this is the most perfect realization of story, because it is knowing what is going to happen, but allowing that agency that creates personal stories of what occurs. Lastly, and just before we wrap up, I want to mention our next foray into exploring how some of these principles become manifest, Festival UK 2022. It's a government commission that looks to inspire a cultural zeitgeist around the potential for the STEAM sector as a creative force. It's a fresh challenge. We're setting out to create an open, optimistic, and original project that will create people emotionally and inspirationally with the role and responsibilities they have as members of the present and the future. We can't share much in terms of details, but I wanted to show this to you because it is taking this idea of story, this idea of how it's architected, to create a world from which stories of people and places and communities emerge using the content that those people generate, from art to theatre to poetry, placing, interacting, spawning, all within a narrative arc that is being built in net to enable that delivery. So we then have questions. I'm all ears for whoever still remains. I have literally no idea how I enable you guys to speak. So unless someone tells me, feel free to bung any questions into the chat, and I will answer them as they appear. Firstly, did anyone find that edifying, interesting, useful in any way? Clicking thing.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I think I.
First of all, thank you so much for all of this. It's really fantastic. It's an eye opener for everybody, I'm sure. Particularly for me. I come from the XR space, but not specifically from the storytelling. But this speaks a lot to me. My question to you is: storytelling using AR is completely different than storytelling using VR as in a VR headset, than storytelling in immersive or like interactive environments, like let's say Web3D or Roblox and Fortnite, etc., etc. How do you see this workflow that you've defined for storytelling works in these different, let's say, angles of the immersive industry? Thanks.
We always view that as, I think I'm understanding your question correctly, we view it as another tool, but also another medium. So where we are drawing on video, there is no reason why we couldn't pivot out to do in the same way that we're harnessing AR storytelling. That is one of the ways in which one story beat is emerging. Now, our ultimate aim is to connect all of these up. So our story is existing, and our world is existing, and then we're manifesting those beats through whichever is most applicable. Now, I love VR. The problem has always been the challenge of porting. We actually had multiple versions of that history portal I talked about earlier, one which was in VR and one which is in AR, to enable slightly different experiences and slightly different takeaways and slightly different emotional resonance with each one. I know it's not an answer because I don't think we have set answers yet, but I do have a commitment, and I do have an understanding that if it is a story, that should be universal. At least that's how we approach it. Hopefully that was interesting, Fadi. Were there any other bits and pieces? I feel like narrative format is vital to all systems moving ahead. It's blood experience stuff, expression, no time. I couldn't agree more, Keith. It seems so logical when you're making any story, you're imagining it. I mean, we wouldn't dream of not incorporating any new technologies. And although we focused on immersive ones, you might as well talk about radio. And in fact, it's one of the things that will be part of Festival 22, radio content, because it's beautiful, it's audio driven, and it crosses over. Treating stories as systems and points of experience seems to us the most sensible. Christine, missed the beginning. You might have already said, how long did it take to create this experience and the size of the team? Okay, so it varies, as you'd expect. The overall, the complete big fix-up took about 18 months, with about 6 months on top either end for testing and team setup and all the rest of it. That had a team which was across 3 companies of about 20-ish people. That was also quite large. The bit that I didn't touch on was that we built an underpinning narrative structuring system, a platform to enable us to deliver the content in real time and to handle all those different user flows. So that gives a slightly false picture of its complexity. The spin-off that we're creating at the moment, Fix Up the City, was done within 6 months with a team of about 8 people working around the core technical delivery, and then another sort of 4 or 5 working in parallel with some of the creative stuff. And that drew elements and objects in, obviously. A standard project, if I can say even such a thing exists, with an immersive experience for us, we tend to tailor around using a core pod of about 6 or 7. We have 3 or 4 additional people who float in as needed. And it tends to be between 6 and 12 months, depending upon the size and scope. So as long as a piece of string. But those sorts of numbers are what we tend to encounter. What else have we got? Have you published narrative theory work? Not even nearly, Stephen. It is a combination of things that we have discussed with other people, things that we have evolved, the R&D that was part of the Innovate UK Audience of the Future work. We see it as a thing to share. I'm going to be completely honest. We contributed some bits and bobs to specifically around this to some of the Unity publications and on the Unity website. I recommend there as a good starting point too, if you want to delve into it some more. What tips, Liz, what tips can you give us to engage users with our story in a VR experience? I think around that first 30 seconds. What we can do to help immersion. Assuming we're talking VR headset, helping immersion, you're going to you will have immersed them anyway, because they are there. The one thing that we traditionally haven't taken seriously enough, that we really made an effort to kind of alter, is sound. Like my background before this was science, and then it was technology, it was communication, it was visual communication, and I always approached things very visually. And then as soon as it comes to immersive, you go, actually the visuals is important, but you give someone a soundscape, they're there. You close your eyes, you listen to a sound, that transports you. So for us, opening with sound, for the big fix-up, we worked with some really incredible people, both on the Aardman side, and the name has completely gone, and I do apologize. No, it's gone, which I feel very bad about. But yeah, so sound, central, immersing in terms of the story. I suppose the other thing to flag here that we experienced with the people when we were doing playtesting for the Wallace and Gromit and for Seuss was that we were often approaching it from a technical literacy point of view. These stories should be accessible. If you're going to be accessible, you need to understand that people don't know what you know. And we were being really dumb. We were going, well, of course they'll know to tap. Of course they'll know to pick up. And you go, no, these are stories. This is completely different. This is completely new. Really benchmarking, allowing people to follow through a process and treating them as if that's the first time ever inside whatever technology, but doing so in a way that's not condescending, that transformed a lot of our experiences in terms of how we built them. It's also a good point there to flag principles of access and inclusion. If you do not have regular solid contact with disability access specialists, I can't heavily recommend it enough. We talk closely with a lady called Kate O'Reilly from DAC. She has, again, transformed the way we think about it. She has this amazing provocation which says, if I, as a disabled person, can be made to experience it, is my experience as rich as yours? This is not about putting some subtitles on it. This is about, does the richness of the experience, even if it has to change, stand up? So that is the other part of users engaging with the story from our side. What is the name of the AI Pro used by teachers and students? Is it openly available to use by Mike? That is our proprietary system that we're deploying to market at the moment. It's called Cognovi. There's some information about it on our website. More than happy to chat to you more about it, Mike, if you like. Questions from Pratham. What about adding interactive elements to it, where the choices you make in the story points have an impact on the story later? 100%, yeah, that is just another form of that choice and agency. Personally, I love that. Having stuff, especially something quietly in the background, that can have quite a large effect. A choice that at first instance appears quite subtle, but actually redefines everything for you later on down the line. What software systems do you recommend us for all jumping to create small versions of these stories like these? Without wanting to sound like a Unity fanboy, Unity, without a shadow of a doubt, the best immersive tech platform there is, the best support you can have, the best forums. As a studio, we pretty much pivoted exclusively to using Unity. And I've gone on record saying how incredibly powerful and useful it is. I don't take any money from them. We use it because we believe in it. Like it's let us create things that we had only dreamed of before. So that's quite an easy one. Someone's thinking the pressure about the Oculus Go, the way it surrounds you, saw me right away. Couldn't agree more, Keith. Christine, immersive. Is the choose your own adventure of this generation that engages as well as teach? I'd learn more about making the experience more inclusive and rich for everyone with disabilities. Any recommendations for more resources on that? Yes, but I don't have them to hand. If you connect with me, if you send me an email, my contact details are there. I will happily send you a bunch of links and stuff around that. I've also got a recording of a talk that I gave on that subject, which I can also send you. Have we got any more thoughts or questions or anything of the like? It's weird because you're listening to your own breathing as you're waiting to see if there is any. If not, Kate, your contact info would be great. So if you click on my profile and go to more, under that you've got all of the contact details for the people. But just for ease, me. Do we have anything else? I'm aware that I sound like I've been pontificating slightly. I really don't mean to, because this is challenge. This is new ground. We've had the opportunity with Audience of the Future and with a lot of the other projects and a lot of the partners that we've worked with to do things that we wanted to explore. And these are our explorations. We are trying to cut a path through the weeds of the unknown. We are not, we don't have the answers. What we have is a commitment to trying, exploring, experimenting. And if I can have shared some of the mistakes, some of the learnings to make it easier for everybody else, that's really kind of why I'm here. What are some opportunities for AR storytelling that will be possible in the next few years that you're excited about? The object detection through AI systems, that for me, that really floats our boat. If you take stories that traditionally die out, people's experiences of war. My partner did some volunteering work in Bosnia and spoke to doing treatments to help rehabilitate people who are in concentration camps. And talking to them about their stories and their experiences and rooting in the places, the things that they encountered, because it was something that happened where they lived, and it was something somewhere they had to go back to, and it happened in their houses. And those stories, those memories, especially from the people who didn't have children, couldn't have children after what they'd experienced, those were dying out. The idea that these could be collated, these could be added to our world, these could be added to objects, and could enable you to hear the voices of these people, that makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There's something meaningful about that. What else we got? Great inspiring, art style, yeah. Hide and seek. Yeah, hide and seek is just endlessly fun. And the art style question is something that often doesn't get talked about. And it's something that we have people having expectations around a lot of the time. So I've sat in board meetings with CEOs who go, oh yeah, digital, what you mean cartoony, what you mean game-like? It's like, not necessarily. Like, as much as we've used examples here, which are quite cartoony, even in different ways, there's nothing to stop this being real, like with real quality verisimilitude. The real-time rendering that Unity are doing, talking about stuff that's going to be possible in the next few years, endless scope for incredibly high quality, very real experiences. I am excited to be able to step back into periods of history that have been faithfully recreated or even unfaithfully recreated and feel as if you're there. I'm a history geek. Like, I'm hand on heart, I'm happy to admit that. The idea of stepping back and seeing these places and these stories, that makes me excited. And I think the combination of fast processing, more efficient systems, more powerful engines, that could be really fascinating. I may or may not have a project that we're soon to announce that literally builds on that, but you'll have to, I can't say anything about it, otherwise I get in trouble. Do we have anything else? I'm aware that we're way over time, and people will be missing out on some people talking that are much more interesting than me, so I'm not going to go too much longer. Of course, people will know how to pick it up. If you've been into gaming, did it feel natural to have a tutorial at the beginning? It is, but a tutorial often wasn't enough, and some was off-putting to certain people. Redefining what a tutorial meant for us was also part of it. Letting people play and guiding them through it and putting in subconscious cues, not as simple as I am now going to dictate what you're doing. Making it as intuitive as possible, and then putting in guides and having characters interact with you in a way that helped you. Now, we do have a tutorial, especially in pretty much everything we do, but not relying exclusively on a tutorial is also really important. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Christine. Thank you, Algos. Yeah, I think we're going to call it, unless there's anything else that slides into the chat. If any of you do have any other thoughts and questions, do reach out to me. That isn't a business pitch. That is just, I hope that I've expressed some of the passion that Sugar have to do what we're doing and why we have some passion for it. We're always happy to talk to people and to share these ideas. This talk will also be available as a download, so grab that, share it around if you think anyone could find it of any use. Thanks, Sarah. Right, in that case, I'm gonna call it. Have an excellent afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you happen to be, and we'll speak soon, variously, I'm sure. Thank you.